Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at my website, chalquist.com/podcast. So today, I want to experiment and play a little bit, and we're calling this session Psyche 101. And what we mean by that is a response to the question, what would our understanding of the self look like if we were to cast some of its operations and dynamics in the language of storytelling? For most of its history, psychology, as a discipline, as a set of practices, as a method of scientific investigation, has tried to use the scientific physical science model to understand what we might call the self, the psyche, the personality, what have you. And so a lot of our psychological concepts are in the language of science, although not all of them. On the depth psychology side of the house, so now we're talking about Pierre Janet, Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, psychoanalysis, analytical psychology. Those traditions are closer to the humanities, and they borrow some of its language, which we'll keep. Nevertheless, even there we find this kind of objectifying, reifying language to describe the self. And so I want to play with that a little bit. What happens when we replace some of those terms? So I'm going to focus mainly on translating depth psychology terms, particularly Jungian, into more fanciful language, just to see what happens. So let's start with the unconscious. Now, this was a term that William James disliked because it made it sound as though there's this place in the head, the unconscious, or the subconscious. It was actually Pierre Janet who got onto this before Freud did. Nevertheless, in some ways it's a negative term. It's what we're unconscious of rather than anything else. James came up with his own term. He called it the transmarginal, which is okay. But I think we can be more fanciful. So I'm going to draw at least a couple of times on some stories that I've been working on for a while now in the area of speculative fiction. Specifically, I've done a bit of world building. And so there exists a series of stories called the Assembling Terrania Cycle. And in those stories, there's an entire realm of being called the Dreamvale. So that's the term I want to use. It's a fanciful fictional term. Now, what does that do for us? So if instead of the unconscious and my unconscious motivations and what's up in the unconscious, we ask what's going on in the Dreamvale, then we're talking about a kind of realm or a layer of reality rather than a thing in the head. And we're a bit closer, perhaps, to what Henri Corbin, the French scholar, referred to as the imaginal. He was a scholar who studied Sufi mysticism and actually more correctly Gnosticism, and of Ibn Arabi. The great Sheikh, as he was called, still is called actually. So where all this is going is, in Islamic Gnosticism, the imaginal is thought of, whether we're talking about Ibn Arabi or Suhrawardi or some of the others, the great explorers of that layer of reality. When we go in that direction, then our perceptions shift, and we suddenly see that the imaginal is outside of us as well as inside. That our imaginings, fantasies, dreams, other expressions of the Dreamvale actually tell us things about the world. It's fairly common, for example, parapsychology studies this, to have a dream about some big event in a place where you're living or staying, and then it happens in a couple of days. So it's as though the Dreamvale part of us, part of our psyche, is tuned into what's happening outside of us. So the Dreamvale, the realm of images, the realm of aspirations and maybe even ideals. That would be a substitution that we can make. Let's say that we have a term like repression. I think we all know what that is, but in case you don't, it's when we force something out of consciousness down into the unconscious. So repress sadness, repress anger, things like that. We usually have a sense that it's there, but sometimes we don't know how much. It can surprise us how much anger or sadness or something else that we're walking around with. Emotional material. What if we called this backstaging? Repression is a reflection of the hydraulic physics of the 1900s, the early 1900s, where depth psychology started out. And if we update that language to be something more in line with story, and it seems like the psyche is more a matter of story than it is of circuitry or hydraulics, then backstaging we can imagine as forcing a character off the stage. So in many cases, we are not only the protagonist of our own inner drama, but we are also the stage director. We stage the drama. So if there's a character we don't like, we put them off the stage. That sounds a lot like repression, especially if that character symbolizes something in us that we're not comfortable with. And notice that this is also a way of understanding what Jungians call the shadow, which is often described as the dark side or the undesirable side of the personality, the things that we don't want to admit to. Although there can be a bright shadow too, that sometimes there are talents and insights and abilities that we're out of touch with in ourselves, and then we force other people to carry them for us. So the shadow makes it sound as though there's this little kind of spy in the head or this little executioner in the head or whatever. And you'll even hear Jungians sometimes say, my shadow did that or whatever. Well, no, you did it. You are your shadow, right? And that's part of the problem with this idea. It makes you step back from what you're actually doing. So, if you're mean to people during the day and then you have a nightmare about a character who's harming people, well, that character is you, right? So if we talk instead about backstaging, we're taking a character and moving him or her or them off the stage. Well, all the characters on the stage are us, right? So then we're in the conversation of what part of me am I exiling? And what would it take to welcome that character back and have a conversation between that character and your sense of I or me? In psychology, it's called the ego. We could just call it the protagonist or even the stage director. How is that character necessary to the story? Sometimes the characters who are most, let's say, trickster-like or chaotic actually play a vital role. So if you think of the archetype of the trickster as actually a quality of the cosmos and not just a clown or an evil villain or somebody like that, a devil figure, well, if it weren't for those quantum fluctuations at the very beginning of the universe, we wouldn't have had stars and planets or us. So it wouldn't be incorrect to say mythologically that we owe our existence in many ways to the trickster, which is why it also shouldn't surprise us that in many people's mythologies, trickster creates the world or the universe. Now, the trickster, of course, is an example of an archetype, and I'm not going to bog down our discussion with a whole technical piece about what archetypes are. We could evoke James Hillman and just say that they're figures of gods, but that doesn't cover a whole bunch of archetypes that have a different quality, more like an existential situation. We'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of these powers with a capital P, that's what I call them in the Assembling Terrania Cycle. It's like, imagine natural forces, existential transitions and dynamics that are sentient. So in that sense, when we talk about Zeus, for instance, that's just a mythic face of the higher view. Or when we talk about Isis, that's the expression of, Jungians would say, the archetype of the Great Mother. But she's a quality of nurturing and maternal care that exists all through nature, not just in our stories or inside our heads. So if we don't like the word archetype, which is somewhat abstract, we could say mythic figures, or gods, or powers, to use the language of my series. These characters are inside us and outside us, and we have dealings with them. They were called aeons in Gnostic mythology, so that would be another read on them. But they're these personifications of something that's more than human or different from human. And we kind of get there through a different door when we think about Brian Swimm's work, and he talks about the 10 powers of the universe. So, for instance, one power is attraction all the way across the cosmos, and shows up in human society. It shows up in the cohesion of matter. It's archetypal. It's all the way down. He refers to that as allurement. And cataclysm is another power of the cosmos. So those are the kinds of lines we're thinking in. But these are motifs, right? They're themes, like literary themes. And that's another way of thinking about these in more storied terms. What are not specific archetypes as things or as nouns, but what are the motifs that hold my life together? What are the motifs that play out in current events? These big existential situations that we all face, rebirth and death and resurrection and joining and the big realities that cover everything that we do. That's one way of thinking about them. The turning points in the story. Speaking of which, psychology, as I think we're all aware, still uses the language of pathology, which it inherited from medicine, problematically in many ways. So instead of pathology, personality disorder, for instance, or this disorder or that disorder, what if we talked instead about role confusion or stuckness? We're stuck in a story that's not serving us because we're literalizing it. We're acting it out literally instead of realizing that it has a deeper message. What if pathology is actually a form of literalism in some ways? Literalism, rigidity, stuckness. What we call pathology or conflict or issues is where the story is stuck, isn't it? And I mentioned role confusion, so there's a specific example of that I want to mention from psychology, which is projection. So the usual understanding, oversimplified, of projection is I project onto you what I don't like in myself and can't face, right? So I see your jealousy instead of mine, or your greed, or your power drives instead of mine, because I'm not comfortable with my own. But isn't that role confusion? Isn't that seeing what belongs to your role in somebody else's role? We don't really project anything. Nothing comes out of our heads, right? We're just making a mistake. We're confusing the roles. We're getting confused about who is what. If you're in therapy and your therapist has a slightly critical tone that they use, and it hugely triggers you, and you feel like your mom or dad are criticizing you, you're in a state of role confusion. You're treating your therapist, who has one role, as though they were emotionally your parent, which is a different role. So in a way, you're not sure what drama you're in. That would be a way of thinking about this. So many of the tragic or conflicted or injurious situations of a life result because we think we're on one stage with a certain set of characters, only to have it revealed that we're actually on quite a different stage from the one we thought we occupied. So the answer then is to get in the right stage, to be in the right show, right? So one concept from Jung that we'll want to keep is his metaphor of dreams as little dramas. That's very good. A dream has a stage setting at the beginning, and then it develops the action and Sometimes there's a climax to it, and sometimes a resolution, sometimes not. But the dream has a dramatic structure. So that's a nice idea. We'll keep that one. But we'll also add that when we interpret a dream archetypally, what we're really doing is relating it to the big primal motifs, not only in our lives, but in our current cultural situation as well. We're asking what the motifs are, the themes that move through the drama. And when we ask that question, it helps us get out of thinking of archetypes as these fixed entities. Like, it's pretty easy to point at somebody and say the trickster or the hero or whatever, but when we think about it thematically, then we're asking ourselves, am I in a drama of rebirth, resurrection and rebirth, or am I in a drama of some kind of transmutation alchemically where something appears in one form and it takes on a different aspect later? So it allows us to ask somewhat more storied questions. Jung used the term active imagination to refer to how you invite these different figures in, these different figures of dreams or fantasies or what have you, and you can talk to them. And a large chunk of Jung's Red Book and his Black Book journals are actually conversations with these different internal figures, which have their own ideas about things, which can be frightening. It frightened Jung at first when the characters that he conjured up started disagreeing with him. And his understanding was that the unconscious has a different viewpoint sometimes than the conscious mind, and that the two together, taken together, can create more wholeness. So what we might think is that the characters in the Dreamvale disagree with each other and with us at times, right? So we can talk about active imagination as a technique, or we can just call it creative fantasy. Creative fantasy, it's the birthright of all of us. It's what we do as humans. We're healthy in many ways to the extent that we can have a creative fantasy life and invite entities and people and figures and whoever in places and let them have a hearing in our internal democracy. Where voices are being repressed, something's going wrong, internally or externally. Now, Jung had this term that he used in letters. I don't think he used it so much in his official work. It popped up a couple of times in the collected works and in other places, but he and his students and associates used to call themselves the Invisible Church, and they didn't mean a literal church. They meant a gathering of individuating people who were in growth, who were cultivating self-awareness. And the image of the invisible church is an ancient one. It has archetypal counterparts across cultures. In Gnosticism, it's referred to as the heavenly church or the celestial church. And so we're deliteralizing it. We're making it symbolic rather than attaching it to a particular religious structure. But we can go even further with that and again borrow from the world of fiction. In my Assembling Terrania Cycle, there's a group of human beings who not only listen to the gods, or whatever we want to call them, presences. They're aware of the huge living existential motifs and transition points of life, but sometimes they push back. Sometimes they have their own mind about how things go. And invariably, these people, this group, they're creative individuals. They're not always whole. They're often afflicted with tremendous suffering and even fragmentation, and aren't always pleasant to be around either. But they're all faithful to their gnosis, to their direct experiential knowing, inside and out. And so they're referred to in my stories as the Trans-Daimonic League. So that might be a fictional body that perhaps we would even like to belong to. I'd like to be a member. They span human history, so members of the League go all the way back. The very first one is mitochondrial Eve, and I wrote a story about her, the mother of all of us. There were humans before her, but all the living humans descend from her. This woman who came from Eastern Africa, she must have been remarkable. And I've often wished I could go back in time and talk to her about What is it like to be you? What are your dreams like? Your intuitions? What are your fantasies about the future like? And then tell her what resulted as, that what came out of her life. We should also mention the term individuation, which means to become an individual. It's not individualism. It's not me, me, me. It's becoming a mature human being. It's self-realization, the cultivation of self-awareness, becoming who you are, all of that. And so individuation is a word that Jung borrowed from the philosopher Schopenhauer, but he gave his own twist to it. And so one of the goals of Jungian therapy is to help people individuate. So this journey of wholeness, and by the way, it's inspired again by Gnosticism, which in Gnosticism there's a realm of being that's actually called the abundance or the wholeness, the pleroma. So Jung early on in his career was reading Gnosticism, and no doubt that gave him some ideas. But there's an implication here that becoming whole is good and not being whole is bad. And unfortunately, there are people in life who will never be fully whole because they've been so injured and so traumatized. And for those or other reasons, they really can't look forward to a journey of wholeness. They can heal a bit more. They can acquire more self-insight, but there's no goal of wholeness that they reach ever. And maybe that's true of all of us in some sense. So I'm wondering if we could talk instead about soulfulness of story, of our story. The soulfulness of the play that we're in, that we're directing. And by soulful, I mean having a quality of emotional depth and embodiment to it, of beauty, even when it's tragic beauty, even when it's difficult beauty. Soulfulness in the sense that when you look at a great work of art, even if it's outwardly ugly or conflictual, but it moves you and you just think, yeah, it can't be any other way. I respond that way to a lot of the work of Van Gogh, not all of it, but some of it. And I just think, wow, this is so soulful. These magnificent trees that just look like they're radiating, and they're just ordinary trees. So there's nothing heroic about this. Individuation can be a heroic path. It isn't always, but if we talk about soulfulness of the drama, of the story that we're in, that I think puts us in a different mood. And maybe we strive a little bit differently, and maybe we're a little bit more okay with our imperfections, which any mature person knows they need to keep an eye on. But maybe we shouldn't persecute ourselves for them. The issues that we revisit over and over. Jung used the image of a spiral. We revisit the same conflicts over and over, but hopefully on higher levels. And sometimes not. Sometimes we just have do-overs. So maybe our strivings can be not about perfectionism, not about can I get to the next level of the internal hierarchy, but maybe it could be more about what's the quality of depth or of meaningfulness or of beauty that I can bring to my story as it interacts with other people's stories. And that's the thing. A story in isolation is one entity, but a story that interlocks with others is part of a collective. It's part of a kind of storied ecology. And here, inevitably, I remember some of the people I've worked with over the years, therapy clients and also students and group participants. And one guy comes to mind who at one time was the member of a very violent organization, a gang whose name I won't mention. But at one point, he became a member of a group I was running. A couple of us were running, actually, in Southern California. They were court-mandated men who had committed violent crimes and gone either to jail or prison. And then they came out and had to do a year of therapy with us. And so we tried to teach them to be mature, peaceful men in the time that we had with them. And actually got very good results most of the time. So the guy I'm thinking about had committed more than one murder. He had been to prison rather than jail. He was very, very hard man. And, came out fearful and paranoid and defended and all the things that you might expect of someone who just got out of prison. And he ended up being one of our best group members. Now, this man, I don't know that he could ever become what people in the New Age world or spiritual achievement world would call enlightened. Maybe he could. I didn't really see that in his future. He had trouble just doing really day-to-day things that for the rest of us aren't a real struggle, like going to the grocery store and things like that, or getting a marginal education, you know. So here was somebody who would never measure up to somebody else's high standards of spiritual perfection. But we asked him in group one time, what was it that turned the corner for you here? You came in pretty indifferent and just wanting to get through this, and then you really started participating and confronting other guys in very firm, respectful ways and just getting it, you know. And he said, there was a day when I was at home and I was armed, which I almost always was in those days. And I bent over to do something, and my young son saw that I was wearing a gun, and he asked me, Daddy, why are you wearing a gun? And in the moment he asked me that, I realized I had to change the world for him. I had to create a world where we don't go armed. And I wanted him to be a better man than I ever could be. So for me, that is a soulful, beautiful moment of one man's life. And so I'm borrowing that to try to convey the quality that I'm having trouble describing here. It's not necessarily something that can be described as wholeness or individuation, although it obviously partakes of both. But it's as though this man's story changed, his drama changed, and he was able to take charge of it in a way that he never had before, in a beautiful way. So I'll mention here that there's some resources at my website you might want to have a look at. Some of them are free and some are for sale. I've tried to price my downloadable courses reasonably, and I've got a bunch of lectures that are like $15 each, and they deal with different aspects of what we're talking about in these podcasts. But some questions that I want to leave you with for this would be things like, what kind of drama, what kind of story do I want the rest of my life to be about? What sort of motifs do I want people to remember my story in terms of? Tragedy, comedy, heroic epic tale, something else, magical tale, incantation. How do I want it to be unfolding from here forward? Who are the key characters in my story? And I don't just mean external people, although obviously they're part of it, but internally speaking, who are the characters? Who are the images? The ones who show up in dreams, my internal cast of characters. And how might I think of what Jungians would call a complex, or other psychotherapists would refer to as issues or defenses? How are those characters too? And what do they want to tell me? Why do they exist? What are they doing inside of me? And do I need to negotiate anything with them? Do I need to give voice to them somehow so that they're not compulsive, making everybody in this drama miserable? There's a beautiful moment in Arthur Miller's play After the Fall where the key character, the protagonist Quentin, looks up into a judge's bench after judging himself harshly for most of his life, and he realizes that the bench is empty. How would that be for you to let yourself off a hook like that? And finally, how can you tend your fantasy life more faithfully so that it interpenetrates your waking life, so that everything that you do and get involved with can have some quality of re-enchantment to it? A quality of re-enchantment that ultimately doesn't hide you from the world, but actually reconnects you with it even more vitally and fully. Thank you.